It's a bit of a slight, isn't it? Yeah. Are we all together, Ian? Or? Okay, well, if we just have the welcome slide. Reminds me to say welcome to everybody, particularly welcome to everybody that's joined here, and a particular welcome to anybody that's joining on Zoom. Next slide, please. Oh, no, we won't. Let's go back. I think I've taken the slide out, which is just to remind us that this is Talking with Micah, which is part of the wider Methodist Walking with Micah project, where we're looking at a range of different issues about justice. And tonight we're going to look about justice in relation to poverty within the United Kingdom. I'm going to hand over to Sarah, our minister, to open with our devotions. And I should welcome her back from a sabbatical. It's great to see her.
Hello everyone, it's really lovely to be here in person this evening. I've been catching up with the previous Talking with Micah sessions online, but I'm really looking forward to our conversations this evening. As I was thinking about that, I was conscious of all the very many different verses in the Bible that speak to the vital importance of caring for the poor, looking out for the oppressed, the marginalised, those in distress, and to always, in whatever it is we're doing, to act justly and with mercy and in love. It made it difficult to try and narrow down which readings to share with you this evening, and I've cheated slightly because I have two. The first is from Deuteronomy chapter 15, and I'm reading from the Message. When you happen on someone who's in trouble or needs help among your people with whom you live in this land that God, your God, is giving you, don't look the other way pretending you don't see him. Don't keep a tight grip on your purse. No, look at him. Open your purse. Lend whatever and as much as he needs. Don't count the cost. Don't listen to that selfish voice saying, it's almost the 7th year, the year of Jubilee, the year of all debts are cancelled, and turn aside and leave your needy neighbour in the lurch, refusing to help him. He'll call God's attention to you and your blatant sin. Give freely and spontaneously. Don't have a stingy heart. The way you handle matters like this triggers God. God's blessing in everything you do, your work and ventures. There are always going to be poor and needy people among you. So I command you, always be generous with open purse and hands. Give to your neighbours in trouble, your poor and hurting neighbours. And the second really short reading is from the first letter of John. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. Thanks be to God. Amen. You might like to reflect on the themes of those passages as we sing Heaven Shall Not Wait.
Shall not wait for the poor to lose their patience. The storm Whom shall not wait for the rich to share their fortunes, the proud to fall, the elite to tend the least. Jesus is Lord, he has shown the Master's privilege to kneel and wash servants' feet before they feast. Whom shall not wait for the dawn of great ideas, thoughts of compassion divorced from cries of pain. Jesus is Lord, he has carried word and action. His cross and company make his purpose plain. Then shall not wait for triumphant hallelujahs, where earth has passed and we reach another shore. Jesus is Lord in our present perfection. His love and love are forever and then
Let's pray. Compassionate God, we praise and thank you for your endless, abundant love, grace and mercy, freely poured out for all. We thank you for the many ways we know your love for us. We come together this evening conscious of the privilege we enjoy and the agency that privilege makes possible. But conscious too that too often we take our privilege for granted and we do not use it to help alleviate poverty and need, or to challenge the structures and systems of injustice that cause so much harm and pain in your beautiful world, to all your beautiful children. We pray that you will forgive us and help us to do better, to be better, to be more as you created us to be. We know too that your heart must break at the state of the world, at the lack of love, for all those who go hungry, who feel hopeless, who are abandoned and ignored. Generous God, help us to see how and where we can act to share your love, grace and mercy, to reveal glimpses of your kingdom here on earth. And loving God, we cannot ignore the plight of those who live in places torn apart by war and acts of aggression. And we continue to hold before you the people of Ukraine, Yemen, Ethiopia and Syria. We wonder how long, O Lord, war will be allowed to continue. We pray for peace. We pray for relief. And we pray that a desire for peace and real hearts of compassion and wisdom would prevail in those in power. Holy God, as we gather together this evening, may we know your presence with us. Open our hearts and minds to all you would say to us, and help us to respond to the promptings of your Holy Spirit. For we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's now my great delight to welcome Niall Cooper, who's Director of Church Action on Poverty. I think you've been there for quite a period, is that right?
25 years.
25 years, so he's got wealth of experience to talk to us about. And Steph Benstead, who's one of the trustees of the organisation. Very sorry I haven't got your picture on the slide, Steph, but I only knew there was a trustee coming till quite recently. So welcome to you both, and I'm now going to hand things over. When we get to discussion, if you want some help setting it up, just give me a nod and we'll work with that. But over to you guys.
Thanks very much. Yes, you get 2 for the price of 1 tonight. A little bit more of an introduction maybe. So I'm Director of Church Action on Poverty, not to be confused with Christians Against Poverty. We both work on poverty, we're both Christian charities. We work in slightly different ways. So what you'll get is our perspective. But it's the same issue that we're both working on, which is poverty in this country, which is challenging and increasingly challenging. Steph can introduce herself in a minute, and then we're going to do it in 2 halves. So the first half is to explore what poverty means, what poverty is in this country, and then there'll be an opportunity for a conversation about that, what experiences you have of poverty, encounters with poverty, your thoughts about it, to explore that first. And then the second half is what does it mean to be a justice-seeking church in the context of poverty then? What's our response to that? So you get not only 2 speakers for the price of 1, but you get 2 sessions for the price of 1. And hopefully everybody in the room will stay for both halves. Hopefully everybody on Zoom will feel sufficiently enticed by the first bit of the conversation to come back for the second half. So that's the format. We're going to do it slightly in discussion style. It's very informal. Steph has got a prepared talk. I have no prepared talk, but I know what I'm going to say, I think. So, Steph, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. I hope it will be interesting because Niall's just made that out to be really good, and I'm like, well, I did prepare a talk, but I've been struggling with my eyes the last few days, so I've not been able to use my computer very well. I'm Steph. I'm one of the trustees of Church Action. I've been a trustee about 4 years. I have a chronic illness called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a disorder of the collagen or connective tissue. And it basically just means nothing in my body works properly, so I'm always tired, always in pain. Generally have to go back to bed in the middle of the day to sleep because after a few hours of being up, I'm just feeling like I'm so sleep deprived that I'll be sick. So I don't work. I live off sickness benefits and disability benefits. I do a little bit of research into social security and disability, usually unpaid. Sometimes I get paid, not at the moment. And I've also been, for the last 4 years, a trustee of Church Action. So Niall asked me to do the first bit, which is about poverty in the UK. There's an awful lot that could be said, and I find I often forget how much of what I know is common knowledge and what isn't. So if I've missed out anything you really want to know about, obviously feel free to ask. And if I know the answer, I'll tell you, and if not, we'll have to go away and Google it. So what is poverty in the UK? There are different ways of measuring poverty. One of them is relative poverty, which means 60% of the median income in a given financial year. So the median income is what the middle person, if you lined everyone up in order from poorest to richest, what does the middle person earn? And then relative poverty is anyone who gets less than 60% of that. The government also uses the term absolute poverty, which sounds like it would be a really helpful measure of this is how much you need to live, but actually it isn't. It's just relative poverty, but it's relative to the median income in 2010-11 rather than the current years. It's not really very helpful. What I have found much more useful is the work done by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation into destitution and the minimum income standard. So the minimum income standard is about not just your food and clothes and shelter, but also about having what you need in order to have the opportunities and choices necessary to participate in society. So it's about what do you need to be able to be a full member of society. It's calculated by members of the public, so the foundation will get a group of single adults or a group of couples who have 2 children and ask them to think, what is the budget that you need in order to meet all your needs and participate in society? And they have a discussion about it, and then the budget they come up with is put before experts. So, for example, they always get a nutrition expert in to make sure that people are spending enough on food to eat a healthy diet. And then they come up with a minimum income standard for different household groups, which in 2019-20 was around £212 a week after housing and council tax for a single adult. So I found in discussion with people that it's often, people can't always get a feel for what any given amount of money means in terms of living off it. And I remember a conversation with some reasonably well-off middle-class single friends who felt that £70 a week after housing was definitely enough. You could definitely get by on that without any problem. So I've put up on the screen, both on the right, what the people in the focus group said you would budget for each of the categories, and then on the left is approximately what I'm spending at the moment. This is with the new electricity and gas prices. I wasn't spending quite that much previously, and that's averaged over a year, so I pay for my winter gas in summer to spread it out. And you can see that the budget that I have to live off is quite a bit lower than what the minimum income standard says. And I would say I am not at the point of choosing between heating and eating, but I am at the point where I have to think about whether I can eat healthily or not. And maintenance of my home is very much dependent upon my dad coming and doing it for me, because I haven't got the ability to do it, and I certainly can't pay someone to come and put in a new toilet because mine leaks, for example. I do find on that I think the food budget looks quite high, but I've seen other studies where they actually looked at what do you need to get a nutritionally complete diet, and it is around £45–50 a week. I don't know anyone who spends that much, but that's about right. And then you can see I'm not really travelling or socialising in my budget. Niall drove me here today. My parents give me lifts. I've got a disabled pass to use public transport, so my budget's not needing to cover transport, so I'm very lucky in that. And my social budget is basically just I have some pet rats at the moment, so I'm not actually socialising. I just wasn't sure where to put rats in my in that. And then the personal budget includes things like when I'm giving to charity, or if my sister's just had a baby, if I take a meal round to her, then I need to factor in the cost of that meal. And the household budget, I've put slightly higher than them, because in their assumptions, people were tenants and therefore weren't actually paying to maintain their home. I'm in shared ownership, so I do have to pay for the white goods and things. So at the moment, I'm trying to save up. Like I said, my toilet leaks, my shower's stopped working, which is fine. I haven't got the energy to shower anyway. I had lodgers in my house until the new year, and they managed to get the room they were using just covered in mould, so I had to pay for a damp specialist to come out and mould treatment. And it's just, that's the bit I think I find hardest, is the costs that you don't expect, but when they come up, they're like 80, 100, 120 pounds, which on my budget takes quite a while to save up for. I also recently discovered that the fruit and veg box that I get delivered has only taken 8 of the last 24 payments that it should have taken, so I owe them about £360 because they've not been taking the direct debits And I'm a bit like, that's about the amount of money I have in my bank account, which I only have in my bank account because my dad gave it to me so that I wouldn't go into my overdraft, so it's not even my money. So, yeah, I thought that was helpful just to see, get a feeling for where money actually goes. When you sit down and look at it, sometimes I still look at my accounts and go, why am I spending so much on my household? But it just comes up and things need fixing and sorting. So then on the next slide, we've got, these are the terms that I find most useful. These aren't official terms. Well, no, so destitution was another study by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where again they got groups of people to sit down and say, what does it mean to be destitute? So they came up with two definitions, one of which was less than £70 a week after housing costs, and the other one of which was that your income was so low that you lack 2 or more of a basket of 6 essential items over the previous month, and those 6 items were shelter, so if you'd slept rough 1 or more nights, food, so if you'd had fewer than 2 meals a day for 2 or more days, heating, if you'd been unable to heat your home for 5 or more days, lighting, if you'd been unable to light your home for 5 or more days, clothing and footwear, whether you have it appropriate for the weather, and basic toiletries. So they said if you missed 2 of those, then you were officially destitute. And the current benefits for a single adult who's unemployed looking for work is about, I should have looked this up, around £74, £75 a week, but people will usually be topping up their housing because the housing benefit won't cover their rent, and they'll also be topping up their council tax because working age adults don't get enough council tax support to cover the council tax. So your typical single unemployed person on benefits claiming everything they're eligible for is destitute. And you're looking at around 2.4 million people in the country at the moment are destitute, of whom 500,000, so 500,000 are children. Of the other figures, so I've put in the relative poverty, 60% of median income. It just gives you a benchmark of how things compare. So I picked, it was a D. They all start with D, which is what I liked. So disadvantaged is what I've called anyone who gets less than the minimum income standard, but has enough to meet their long-term subsistence needs. So it's someone who, it's sort of where I am. You can afford your food and your heating, and you can maintain your home, but you're not going on holiday in the UK. You're not having a meal out with your family. You're not having a hobby. If you've got a pet, someone else is probably paying the vet bills. And then deprived, again, that was one of the Joseph Rowntree figures that they used, was 75%, which is roughly equivalent to, if you looked at their budget of £212, if you took off the social budget and the alcohol budget, so you're just looking at the necessities, that's around £150 a week, which is around what I get as someone who's treated as not capable for work or work-related activity. That's about what I get, but I have to use some of that towards my disability costs and topping up the council tax, which is why on the previous slide my allowance for the week wasn't 150, it was about 100. So if we go the next slide, so this is just, again, you can see the single adult on means-tested benefits. It's only getting a fraction of what they need to live. They're basically destitute. Interestingly, pensioners can be in poverty. They might be below the relative poverty line, but then normally, if they're claiming all their benefits, they'll usually be in disadvantaged because they can claim enough. And they used to get more than 100% of the minimum income standard, but with costs going up there, even though pensions have been going up quite fast, they've also not kept up. But also I think for pensioners who are in poverty, for quite a few of them, it's because they're not claiming benefits, whereas for your unemployed single working age adult, they're destitute despite claiming benefits. If we go on the next slide, I think that's the difference. So that's just showing the percentage of the country. So 28% is below the minimum income standard. So at the very least, they're disadvantaged relative to everyone else because they can't participate in society fully. And 17% are deprived or destitute. And the next slide should give us, so this is different households, the amount of poverty that people experience. So you can see that children are really struggling with poverty at the moment. If you're a child with a lone parent, then you're going to have 71% have less than the minimum income standard. So at the moment, we've got about 14.5 million people after housing costs are in relative poverty. This includes 4.3 million children, 2.1 million pensioners, and 8.1 million working age adults. But as we saw on a previous slide, it's the children and single adults tend to be in deeper poverty than pensioners and couples. So the peak of poverty as a percentage of the population was 2013-14, but obviously the population's growing all the time, so we have many more individuals living below the minimum income standard. So we've got 18.2 million below the minimum income standard compared to 16.2 million in 2008-09. And we also know that destitution is growing. As I said before, there's 2.4 million people in the UK currently destitute, and half of all destitute people experience some level of disability. So these are people who will really struggle to find a way to increase their income because they haven't got the health or the capacity to do it. And we also know that although if you're not in work, you're much more likely to be in poverty, because so many people are in work, in absolute numbers, there are more people in work in poverty than there are out of work people in poverty. And if you're interested, Manchester has the second highest rate of destitution in the country after Middlesbrough. I should go on the next slide. So there's a range of different causes of poverty that can be brought up. If you are perhaps more right-wing minded, then you'd often be talking about individual factors like, did someone not finish school? Are they just going for low-level jobs? Do they have a bad attitude towards work? Do they just break up with their partner? And you'd be focusing on individual factors and going, well, what we need to do is incentivize people to work. We need to teach them to stay in their relationships, and we need to make it really negative to be on benefits, because the actual issue is that people don't want to work. So we need to make work look better than benefits, and we'll do that by making benefits worse rather than by making work better. There are random events that can cause poverty. So that was for me when I was 21 and I started to become ill. Like prior to that point, I was your standard middle-class kid expecting a middle-class career. After that point, couldn't work, became dependent upon my parents and then on the state for benefits. And also if a relative has become ill and you have to care for them, or if you are an industry that is making redundancies, and those are things that aren't anyone's fault but can cause poverty. And then there are structural factors. So if there aren't enough jobs in the economy, it's inevitable that some people won't get work. If there's not enough housing, then housing costs will be high relative to what people can afford. If the government's not subsidising healthy food, then people will either have to eat unhealthy food or struggle to pay for healthy food. We know at the moment energy prices going up and the government's not subsidising it in the way that other countries are. Transport, if you are relying on expensive modes of public transport, for example, you live in Manchester rather than London, so the bus fares aren't subsidised to the same extent, then you're spending more on transport. And these are all things outside of someone's control. If you go on the next slide. So this is some data that was collected that helps to show some of the structural impacts of poverty. So we've got 4 children, Amira, Beatrice, Chanel and Debbie. When they are just under 2, Amira and Beatrice are in the bottom 10% for cognitive performance, and Chanel and Debbie are in the top 10. But by the time they are 10, Beatrice has shot up and is now in the top 10% with Chanel, whereas Debbie has collapsed and is only a little better than Amira. So one explanation is that Debbie just didn't bother to work, and that's why she's not done very well, because she's just a lazy kid, whereas, I have to work out which one it is. Beatrice is a very hard-working kid who should be praised for doing really, really well. If we look at the next slide, the actual difference what made the difference was the wealth of the parents. So the 2 children who were born to wealthy parents were doing really well once they reached the age of 10, regardless of their, let's say, innate performance at 2 years old. Whereas Debbie and Amira were born to poor parents, so Amira didn't have the opportunity that Beatrice did to boost her performance, and Debbie didn't have the opportunity that Chanel did to maintain her performance. So you're taking children who have the same sort of baseline performance when they're 2, and by the time they're 10, their performance is related to how wealthy their parents are, rather than to their own innate ability, which says a lot about how structural factors are impacting people's abilities rather than individual factors. And this is something that you actually see across the whole income gradient. So people who are born to middle-class parents generally do better at school than those born to working-class parents, but equally children born to upper-class parents do better than middle-class. But most middle-class parents and children of middle-class parents don't tend to sit there and think, oh, those upper-class kids are so much more hardworking than me and have such better attitudes towards work, and that's why they're doing so much better than me. You tend to think they're doing well because of their parents' wealth, and it's essentially the same for middle class compared to working class. It's just we have a cognitive bias to think we want to praise ourselves for our success and not attribute it to random factors. And then if someone else has struggled, we want to say it's their fault because we want to be able to believe that it won't happen to us. So we want to think that we've got control. Should we go on the next slide? So this is just going to be just without really presenting huge amounts of evidence for you, I'm just going to state the conclusion that the evidence is overwhelming that it is social condition acting through life course that influences health and health inequity, and the same can be said for poverty. So all the associations that you see between poverty and education, poverty and unemployment, poverty and health, poverty and relationship breakdown, it's predominantly from the direction that poverty causes ill health, poverty contributes to relationship breakdown. Poverty is what prevents children from getting a good education, rather than sort of the right-wing perspective, which is the other way around. And this really matters because if you think that the issue is people's attitudes and choices, then it's really easy to design policy. Like I said before, you just make benefits really hard and then everyone will magically go out to work, which is why we've seen full employment for the last 40 years and why the economy is really thriving and why there's next to no one struggling in destitution. Unfortunately, that isn't what has happened. The simplistic explanation that wants to blame individual factors and then control people's behaviour hasn't worked, and the reason it hasn't worked is because actually the government has a much bigger role to play in society than that. Go to the next slide. I think there should be another one. Have we run out? Oh, maybe I thought I had two more. Anyway, I will just talk without the slides. When I was doing some writing a couple of years ago, I came up with some principles that I've called the chorus principles. So these are about sort of government's responsibility and citizens' responsibility. So there is a core set of rights which the UN says every country has to provide for its citizens and residents, and that is that you have access to food, shelter, primary education, and primary health care. But then countries are required to build on that to provide a much more holistic set of rights, so that you have access to secondary healthcare, secondary schooling, tertiary education, access to decent housing, access to decent jobs, access to the opportunity to contribute. And so the idea of the rights that the government provides is that this should give people opportunity. It should give people opportunity to access the jobs they want, opportunity to participate in social life in the way that they want, opportunity to have family relationships and friends relationships. And then there should also be a principle of reciprocity, which for a lot of years the mantra has been that the people of the country need to meet their responsibilities. But I think the issue is actually more that the government's not meeting its responsibilities. If the government doesn't make sure there's enough jobs for everyone, then there are going to be people who are unemployed whether they want to be unemployed or not. If the government doesn't provide enough housing for everyone, then there are going to be people who can't afford decent housing, however much they want to pay for better housing. So the important part of reciprocity is that the government needs to step up to its side of the challenge and give people access to good jobs, give them access to healthcare so that they can get better if they're ill, give them access to education so that they can learn and have the skills to meet the jobs, give them access to transport, access to nature, give them the time to spend with their families. And when you give people that, they can then make the choices about what they do, whether they choose to go in a lower paid job and have less responsibility at work if they don't like responsibility, whether they choose to go in a higher paid job but travel further for it, whether they choose to work part-time because they want to spend more time with their family. Give people the opportunity, because then they can build on what they've got. They can build their way out of poverty. If you've got access to a job, if you've got access to housing, if you've got access to transport, then you don't need to stay in poverty. And at that point, if someone's in poverty, the government can go, well, what's going on perhaps more emotionally, and then you might want to look at churches to provide the relationship support. Two of the other principles that I particularly am keen on are universality. So I'm not really in favour of means testing. I think it tends to result in a country where the better off people don't feel that they're getting anything or the same amount back, so they don't feel an investment in the status of the NHS or social care or even the adequacy of income replacement benefits. So they don't want to pay higher taxes. They want to spend, they want to give less to the government and see cuts for poor people rather than seeing it as something that they're investing in so that if they need it, the support is there. And then finally, the success that we see from technology, from development, should be shared with the whole of society and not just siphoned off to a few people at the top. And just to finish, I wanted to just share a little bit about the experience of poverty. So I've given you some data. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my notes, which I've realised were in a different place on my phone. And I did show you my sort of breakdown of spending to try and get a better feel for it, but that doesn't really get across some of the emotion. So when I had to sit down and look at what my electricity and gas were going to be for the next year, if I used the same amount as last year but on April prices, the difficulty is the lack of control, because we're going into summer, so I'm not going to have my heating on anyway. Prices are probably going to go up in October, but I don't know how much by. I don't know what the winter's going to be like next year, how hard it's going to be. So I don't know how much money to set aside to cover next winter. I can't control what the prices are going to be or what the weather's going to be like, so I don't know how cold I'm going to be next winter. I don't know how cold to be right now in order to compensate for next winter. All of my hobbies, like gardening, all of any holidays I've been on in the last 10 years. I think I paid for 1 week away in the UK and 1 weekend break, but all my other holidays have been from my family. And my hobbies, again, it's like birthday money, Christmas money. And that's fine. Like, I don't really mind my parents paying for me to go on holiday with them. But the difficulty is if I start running out of money for other things. So I had a dog up until recently, and he had quite high pain levels. My dad had to help me out with the painkillers. But then I sat there looking at it and going, well, actually, the year before, I'd given some money to a local school, and maybe I shouldn't have done that because now my dad has to help me out with my dog. So I'm sitting there going, what am I allowed? Like, my dad wouldn't be at all happy if, like, worrying that I felt like this, but I'm acutely aware of what I spend. In the end, my backdrop is mostly my dad, but also my sister, to some extent my brother. And if I run out of money because I gave some money away, or because I bought something nice for my garden, or my TV broke and I let myself buy a new second-hand one, I'm sitting there going, well, do I have the right to spend that money like that when I also know that my backstop ultimately is my family, and they end up paying for me? You have to learn to live with things that don't work. So I've said my toilet leaks. Fortunately, my sister's mother-in-law is redoing her ensuite, so I'm getting a free toilet from her. My dad will fit it, so I don't have to pay for that. But my shower doesn't work. I can't currently afford to pay for that because I've got this debt to this fruit and veg company that I didn't know because they hadn't been taking the direct debits. So a lot of like my household stuff can only be dealt with if my dad does it. And then the other aspect is when you have to be thrifty with something. So I've always quite liked patching clothes if they get a hole in them, and taking pleasure in saving something that I could have thrown out if I'd wanted to. And knowing that I can wait till I've got a quiet evening where I feel like sitting down and doing some sewing, but also if I get bored, I don't actually have to do it. When you're doing it by choice, you get that positive emotion about what you're doing. When you're doing it from necessity, which is now where I'm at, you don't get that positive emotion. So, like these last few days when I've had to repair some clothes and my eyes haven't been working, so I've been really struggling to focus, I've been feeling sick, I've been getting headaches, and it takes a long time to do it, like to sew something neatly enough to actually then be able to wear it in public. You just feel the stress of it and the burden of it, rather than being, oh, I'm thrifty, this is nice. So it's just emotionally very different, choosing to be thrifty versus having to be thrifty. Again, like, I keep my house at the moment around 19 degrees, which, you know, a year ago when I'm going, this is nice, I'm trying to help climate change by not heating my house too much, but bearing in mind that I'm not very physically active, so I do get cold. Whereas now, if I'm sat in my house feeling cold and losing circulation to my fingers, I'm like, this isn't because I'm trying to be nice for the climate, it's because I can't afford to put the heating on anymore. And I think it's the different emotions depending on why you do something, and the lack of control, which I first experienced when I became ill and my health was going downhill. I didn't know when it was going to stop. I didn't know what I'd end up being able to do. And you have to learn, you learn about putting your trust and dependence in God and about serving him with the capacity that you've got rather than the capacity that you wish you had. But then when it comes again in a different form, so now it's hitting me financially, because up till now I did have some savings and I had previously been working 4 hours a week, and that little bit extra money has made the difference, whereas I've now run out of savings. I haven't got the job, the energy bills are going up. And I'm not destitute, and I do have family support. But it's still emotionally really hard, and I think that's what is perhaps the most important thing to remember about poverty, because it's easy to just imagine that someone is poor but otherwise in a decent house, in a decent area with access to nature, rather than think of someone who can't maintain their home, can't get out to nature, doesn't really feel like they've got any control over their life, and is facing a situation where they don't know how much money they need to put by for the future. They don't know if they can put any money by for the future. And that lack of control is really quite frightening. And I think from what I've read of people in much worse poverty who are in destitution, that is really emotionally incredibly difficult and can leave emotional scars that last for years. And I think it's really important to remember that and not think that because we're a developed country that we don't have poverty to an extent that matters, because we do. I think that talk might have gone on a lot longer than I'd intended, but...
That's fine. Thanks, Steph. Thanks so much. And not just giving us the facts and figures, but the emotion of it. And the scary thing for me, everybody's story of poverty is unique. So I really do want to thank you for yours. But also knowing that there are literally millions of other people experiencing similar things. And with the energy bills and all of the cost of living crisis, more people now are experiencing and will be experiencing that challenge. So I think what I'd like us to do is just take 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, probably in small groups, simply an opportunity to discuss, to respond, how you feel about what Steph said. And I think it's also important to recognise, I always feel this, poverty you can talk about as an intellectual thing. It's a thing. Actually it's not, it's emotional. And sharing it is incredibly courageous and powerful, but hearing it as well is also emotional. So I think the opportunity to actually reflect on how you feel about what you've heard, and then we can get into a conversation about, so what do we do?
Very much. Just on the practicalities, I suggest we can probably make 3 groups here. Not quite sure what's happening on Zoom, but Ian will allocate you to rooms. We do need to just specify a time so that if anybody doesn't want to join the Zoom room, they know when to come back. So I suggest we talk about about 10 minutes. It means we come back together at half past, if that's okay. Yeah. Just in light of what Niall's just said, it might be that one of you in each group wants to start with a word of prayer. I think we can start with right. 3 groups. We came up in the groups immediately. What's going to happen is that Niall and Steph are going to have a little bit more input for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a more open discussion then. So if there's anything that's come up in your groups you'd like to raise with our two speakers, please do it then. And anybody on Zoom, if you've got any comments that you'd like to throw into that wider discussion, please put them on chat, and Ian will monitor the chat. So back over to two.
Okay, so we're going to explore in the next 15 minutes what it means to be a justice-focused church in response. We're going to do it by exploring the three themes that we think have some, well, there's plenty of other ways, but we're going to explore three themes of dignity, agency, and power as kind of guiding principles. And explore those together. And then we're going to have an open conversation. So, first one is this idea of dignity. Steph, what for you what's the connection between poverty and dignity?
I tend to think of dignity as, in this context, as being about being able to meet your basic needs, because in general it's going to be undignified if for some reason you can't meet them, and people will often feel quite ashamed if they're going to a food bank, for example, to get food. There's a lack of dignity when you're receiving just direct handouts and charity as a result of being in poverty. I do find the three tend to blend into each other. Like in my head, they're very clear, and as soon as I start talking about one, I realise I've just merged onto another one. But I think biblically, then we obviously need to uphold the dignity of people because we're all made in the image of God. And if you reflect on just how much God loves each person and the worth that he places in us, then I do find that usually leads into wanting people to be able to feel like they've got dignity. And if you look at some of the Old Testament laws that provided for people in poverty, some of that was about dignity. So, for example, if someone needed to get a loan because of their poverty, then the lender wasn't allowed to go into their house to choose an item in pledge. So it was like he wasn't allowed to reach that person's privacy. He wasn't allowed to say which item he was going to take as pledge. He also wasn't allowed to take the millstone, which would have been like how they would have produced food. So it's like he wasn't allowed to prevent someone from accessing work, and he also wasn't allowed to take their cloak, or if he did, he had to return it at night time, so they had somewhere to sleep. So in the laws around debt, it wasn't really about, well, it never was about repaying the lender. It wasn't about, does the lender get his money back? How is the lender protected? It's all about what's the dignity of the person who needs the money. How is his privacy retained? How is his access to shelter and food and work retained? How is he able to feel like he's got some level of dignity, even though he's the one in the less powerful situation?
We could, and we really haven't got the time to get into a conversation about what being subject to the rules of the Department for Work and Pension do for your dignity. But let's not go there for now. One of the things that we as a charity have been doing for a few years is working with Stockport Homes in promoting a model which is different to a food bank, which is the local pantry. Any of you come across? In Stockport there are 5 local pantries run by Stockport Homes. We've been working with them to kind of roll the model out nationally, and there are now 70 local pantries in the network. But the importance for us about pantries is it's not charity. It's a food club that you join, so you're a member, and you pay a weekly fee. which is small, £3 or £4, and you get £20 worth of food. But that's all about dignity, that you're a member, and quite a lot of the volunteers in the pantries are members as well. So you have a stake in the pantry. It's your pantry, and the whole language is around this, your local pantry. It's not our pantry that you're coming to. You're a member of your pantry, and that's helping you. And in some ways, it's a kind of cooperative model. But I think throughout that question, how, in terms of engaging with poverty, with people we encounter, do we enable people to retain their dignity? So that's dignity. Agency is a more interesting. I can seem puzzled. Normally, the language we use around agency is organisation. So Christian Aid is an agency of the churches. But what we're talking about here is something slightly different. So Steph, again, what's your take on?
So agency here I tend to think of as your ability to have choice and control over your life, to be an agent in your own life and to be the main agent in your life. It means that, for example, you have enough money to be able to choose where you spend it and you're not dependent on someone else telling you you have to spend it on this particular area or you're not allowed to spend it on that area. It means that people who want to work can find work. So this is where we come back to the government's responsibility to make sure there are enough jobs, because people generally want to contribute to society and receive something back for that contribution. So paid work is generally the way that we do that in our modern society. And again, if we go to the Bible and sort of the Old Testament laws that God gave for his society, he had laws about work and about the treatment of workers, but also in his laws for people who were in poverty, he essentially said that someone had to employ you for 6 years. It was a much more rigid contract than we have now, in the sense that you couldn't leave within that 6 years, but also your employer couldn't fire you within those 6 years. And he had to make sure that he was still required to pay you well and pay you promptly, give you good working conditions and so on. So God had set up in Israel a structure that meant that if someone couldn't continue to farm their own land, which was the baseline position, someone else was supposed to employ them, and they could then use their ability to work by providing labour for someone else and being paid for it. And you can also see it a bit in the gleaning laws, that at harvest time, business owner wasn't allowed to just suck up all his profit to himself. He had to make sure that some was left available to others, and it wasn't just given to them. So they hadn't worked for it in the sense that they hadn't done the ploughing and the seeding and the weeding, but they still went out and actually did a bit of the work in collecting it. And it meant that they had, some choice over which field they went to and how much they collected and when they collected it. So they would have a bit more of that choice and decision, again, in their own lives, and they would have the resources to be able to make choices and decisions, which is one of the things the government doesn't really offer people when you're on social security. Is they say they're so keen for everyone to get into work, but they then don't provide people with the resources to survive, let alone invest in yourself or find a better job or a better place to live or whatever it is that is needed.
And the other thing for me about the context of agency, the question is who's best placed to know how to solve poverty? And in my experience, in our experience, actually the radical idea is that people in poverty are the best people. Society would say people in poverty are the least best at solving their problems because of the stigma attached. But actually in our work, when you get a group of people who experience the problem in a room together, they can come up with the best solutions. And there's another whole piece of work that we do, which is called Self-Reliant Groups, which is getting small groups, mostly of women, together. It's a model that's come from India, but we're doing it in the UK. Everybody in the group saves £1 a week. There's a couple of groups where they save 50p a week because £1 is too much. But again, they're invested in the group. As a group, they look at what their skills and talents are, and for some it might be sewing or crafts or cooking, and then they look to generate some money. And the most beautiful story I can share from one group, from Jane, who's a kind of big advocate in Salford for this. Her group raised about £200. And as a group, they decided to give the money away to another charity. Not that none of the people in the group could have done with that money, but actually what gave Jane so much joy was the agency of being able to give money away. And the reward, that she wasn't just a taker, she was somebody that could give. So again, how do we, in churches, see people in poverty not as a problem to be fixed, but as can we create space for people who are experiencing poverty to come together and tell us what needs to change. And that's can be quite scary, because we like to think that we know the answers. And the last theme, we're kind of exploring these quite quickly, but we can come back to any of them, is around power. Which is, again, I find an interesting conversation to have in church particularly. But I'll start with Steph. What's your take on power?
So power here, I feel, is talking about your ability to make a wider change. So if agency was about the choices and control you had over your own life, power is about whether you have any influence on society around you. And one of the things that we have at Church Action on Poverty is speaking truth to power, which is finding people who are experiencing poverty and providing a way for them to go and speak to politicians, for example, or to appear on the media, and therefore to have their voices heard, which is an element of power, because you start to change the narrative or to challenge the existing narrative. And again, if we look at the Bible, I was doing some study of the prophets in the Old Testament law recently, and trying to think about, like, what is the approach that God takes? Does he take an approach of trying to maximize happiness? Does he take an approach of doing what results in the most optimal outcome? So, for example, if you had two people with kidney disease, and one of them was a top-ranking civil servant and one of them was a lower-ranking civil servant, then a utilitarian analysis would say, if you could only treat one, you treat the top-ranking civil servant, because they're the one who's going to get restored to the best health and do the best work. Whereas if you were going, well, what's fair? Ideally, you treat both. But you might go, well, actually, the high-ranking civil servants had quite a lot of good luck in their life, and maybe we should help the lower-down person. But when I was trying to think, well, what is the approach God takes? What I felt I was coming out from the Old Testament was that God does what's best for the poor. So again, with the debt laws, there was nothing about the lender getting their money back, because actually every 7th year the debts were cancelled, and if it was 6 years, 364 days, and someone came to you going, I'm in desperate need, please can you lend me some money? You weren't allowed under God's law to say no, and if you said no, that was a really wicked thing to do. You had to lend, even though you knew the very next day it was going to be cancelled. And when you look at the Jubilee laws, which were every 50th year, the returning of property in an agricultural society where that was also there for your business, your access to food, your ability to provide for yourself, was a massive redistribution. We don't think Israel actually ever did Jubilee, but the principle God gave was a redistribution of wealth and resources and the ability to provide for yourself. And a lot of the time, power is about how much money you have. So if you redistribute resources, you are redistributing power. And that is what the Old Testament laws set up to do. It was to increase the power available to the poor, if necessary, by restricting what would otherwise have been thought to be the basic rights of the rich.
So, my last parting shot in terms of this bit of the conversation is Martin Luther King is best known for the civil rights work he did. Actually, he was at the point of launching a poor people's movement, which was that his other passion was around poverty. And I haven't got the quote in front of me, but he wanted to be powerful. Because if you want to build a just society, you can't do that by without transforming or challenging unjust structures. And to do that, you need to be powerful. And the civil rights movement mobilised 1 million people. We've never had anything equivalent in the UK. But what would it be to mobilise the power of the church, to mobilise the power of local communities, to mobilise the voice of people in poverty, to actually call for a just society, and for the church to see this as a core part of its mission. For the denominations that are signed up to the 5 marks of mission, and I'm not sure whether the Methodist Church is, but the Anglicans are, the URC certainly are. The 4th mark of mission is transforming the unjust structures of society. So a core mission of the church. This is a core mission of the church. And if the church is serious about that, then do we want to put our money where our mouth is and actually build a powerful movement? So that's our aspiration as an organisation, but we can't do that without partners and allies across the country. So if you'd love to be part of building a powerful movement in Bramall, then we'd love to work with you. We've thrown a lot of ideas there at you, so there's 10 minutes now or so for you to respond, to ask questions, to throw in ideas. So see where we go.
I'm only really picking this up in order that I can distribute it to hear the voices in the room. Chris.
I think you're quite right, sir, in your last statement. In my opinion, there is one reason for poverty in this country, and that is the corrupt and immoral tax system that is supported by all parties and that has been in use for my lifetime. And looking around, I'm among the eldest here. I would like to see the church putting pressure on the government, and I've written to my MP 3 times, I've written to Boris once, and I've written to Keir Starmer once on this subject, and I've not had a reply from any of them. The main problem, of course, is that they have too many cronies in Parliament on the fiddle.
Want to respond?
Yes, I think I'm not going to respond to the cronyism. I think, but it does reflect that the voice of people in poverty in politics is not heard. I think, that's a big generalisation, but the interests that do get heard very loudly are people with a lot of money, because they've got, they can buy influence, they can buy peerages now, you can buy citizenship. There's lots of things you can buy with money. Middle class people also have power and influence, and people at the bottom struggle because they don't. And that's where I think absolutely the church needs to be aligned with people who are, that for me is the litmus of, is the church true to its calling to be on the side of people on the margins and persist with that. We're talking about building a social movement that will take 5 or 10 years. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. But we need to get politicians that understand and hear, and make it uncomfortable. If you think about the civil rights movement, I've mentioned Martin Luther King, it made it incredibly uncomfortable. And as Christians, we're too wary, we don't like conflict. But it's being courageous to actually challenge and challenge and challenge again. And if on your own you don't get anywhere, bring a mate. And if the two of you don't get anywhere, bring 2 mates. And when if you get 500 people in a room, if you could ever get 500 people in a room in Bramhall to talk about poverty, your MP's mind would change quite quickly. But that isn't going to happen overnight either. But that's, what will it take to get poverty to the top of the political agenda?
Thanks, really interesting talk. The thought that was going through my mind just when you were talking was P&O ferries, sacking their entire workforce and then employing other people for around about half the price, I think. And that's not exactly helping people out of poverty, but anyway, that's just an observation. The question I was working around is, you talked about the poor being able to solve poverty, being best placed to solve poverty. How does that manifest itself? What I was wondering. And also, on your helpful leaflet, it says, shout loudest. It's the only way to be heard. How do you get heard?
I'm going to hand over to Steph to talk about the Manchester Poverty Truth Commission.
Yeah, so this is both a way of voices being heard and people in poverty being involved in the decision making. So in a Poverty Truth Commission, you take around 15 people who are in poverty, generally not people who are destitute because they probably need to be focusing on that. So it's often people who may have previously been destitute but are now stabilised a little bit but still in poverty. And then 15 business or civic leaders. So for Manchester, we had the deputy head of revenue and benefits from the council. We had someone senior from the police. We had people from the NHS, people from the universities, someone from Lloyds Bank, from some people from different charities. And we got together for a period of 12 to 18 months. I got a bit confused because of COVID. And we spent a lot of time just talking about poverty, sharing experiences, building relationships. And then we went into 3 task groups. I was in one that was looking at debt, council tax benefits. We had one on exploitation, so like criminal exploitation, sexual exploitation for money. And then another group was on family and children in poverty. And we then, as a group, in the task groups, what happened was those of us who were there because of experience of poverty would put forward an idea that we'd had, and then the business and civic leaders from our group would listen and go, oh, it can't work because of this or that, and we'd all be like, oh, really glum. But then the next month, the business and civic leaders would come back and be like, oh, well, we listened to what you said, and we get the idea, of what you're thinking, what you're trying to achieve, and here's a different way that we could perhaps make it work instead. And so that was like the whole process. There were some smaller ideas, some bigger ideas. I know the guy from the police midway through just went and changed some of the training that his police officers got off the back of what one of the ladies there said about her experience with police as a teenager. So there's been quite a number across the country, and changes can be really small, like council tax envelopes now tend to be white rather than brown, because brown is usually from the DWP. I don't pay tax, so I don't get HMRC letters. DWP is generally a bad letter, and even if it's mostly a good letter, you only need 2 or 3 bad letters to be scared of all of them. So they changed the envelopes to white, just because it's a whole lot less frightening when it's the letter from the council tax rather than the letter from the DWP. And then some bigger changes, so some that we're still sort of trying to find a way forward on, is a way to help people in debt to maybe have the opportunity to do some volunteering as a group, get some of life skills course, maybe get some debt advice, but also perhaps get a financial gift from the community, from a church, from Lloyds Bank, because that was the guy we had, towards their debt. So we're looking at trying to get a package of support. And that idea originally came because I went to the council and said, how about people with council tax debt do some volunteering in the community and you write off £10 of their debt for every hour that they do? And they were like, we cannot afford to do that. So the council tax lady then went away and came back and was like, well, look, maybe we could set up a much bigger scheme and get funding for it. And that's something that's still like going on in the background. And I guess, and then some of the other stuff, I do research on social security and disability. I brought a book out on it a couple of years ago, which I always carry copies around. And some of the research that I want to do in the future is talking with people with chronic illness about what is their capacity for work, what is their capacity for activity, how do they know, try and develop a better benefits assessment system. But there's also been a commission on social security recently, which again took people in poverty, people on social security, and said, like, what are the principles you want for a social security system that works? So there are organisations, there are people around who try and develop, like, from their experience, from research, try to get a feel for what would work instead. And then if you're lucky enough to find someone like Church Action on Poverty or the Commission on Social Security, someone who's already got a little bit of influence, then you try and share your research with them and try and find a doorway to politicians that way. But I think, again, churches do, if more churches would talk about this issue, because at the moment, if we can talk to politicians, but it's like leading a horse to water. You can't make a politician care, and you can't make them hear just because you're talking at them.
Very heartened to hear what Chris said. That's wonderful, the work he's done, writing to getting no response. Heart's in the right place. Your response to that was also very good. Asking for what can the churches do? My opinion is churches lack leadership. We've been talking about Martin Luther King, who ultimate sacrifice would have done a lot more had he not been killed. Our churches do not show any leadership. Never hear anything radical at all coming from Archbishop Canton. Somehow locked in the political system, doesn't say, hey, after URC, justice, it's just very lacking. Leadership there from top, get lots of local people in local churches. What you want, leadership from the top, hammering the point to the government that they need to do something about poverty rather than fiddling about little things that have little relevance, but they spend a lot of time on that rather than working on what really matters. And they alone can do it. If they muster the troops together, they'll get something done. Thank you.
That. I feel the same. It's hard because it takes time to build networks and connections. So I might feel like I've got something to say, but I can't necessarily get to the person who I want to have hear it. One thing I do think would be potentially helpful, or I've wondered if it would be helpful for church leaders, would be if they all had to do 2 hours or an afternoon a week of some kind of voluntary work in the local community with people in poverty, whether it's just they go along to the local food bank, the local pantry, whether they go and help out as an after-school club, or they go do some litter picking, or they help clear. In my area, there's quite a lot of overgrown gardens, so I organise a group that goes and helps clear them. And because I think if you don't have like direct experience or contact with people with direct experience, it's so very easy to forget those issues, but also your priorities shift. So when people talk about social care at the moment, there's an awful lot of concern amongst politicians for allowing people to keep like 100,000 of the value of their home and not have to spend it on social care. Whereas from where I am and the people on my street, they don't own a property. They're not going to own a property by the time they're retired or needing social care. It's a totally different conversation about what they need from social care and how much they need the government to put in, compared to people who are going, well, what about my kids' inheritance? What about my inheritance if my parents have to spend it on social care? That would be terrible if they spent my inheritance. But if you're not living in that different situation, and then where I live now, it's a working class area. One of my neighbours recently finished an Open University degree, but I don't think anyone else on my street has gone to university. Whereas I grew up middle class and pretty much everyone I knew went to university. So again, it's just totally different experience. And I think if our church leaders got into the lowest communities and served and listened and built relationships, you can't not start to care. And you can't, well, I don't think you can not care. And those become the issues that you care about because you meet these people, you have a relationship, you care about them. So when they come to you because they're subject to the bedroom tax, or they've got really bad joint pain and they live in a first floor flat, or there's difficulty at the kids' school, or they're worried about gangs and knife crime going up, you care because they're your friends, they've become your friends. And that's I think is when you'd start to see change, when you connect the people who are the leaders with the people at the bottom. So I guess one of the things another way would be to do like a church poverty truth commission, where you get church leaders to meet people from the local community and listen to their stories and care. But yeah, I think starting at the bottom, like the grassroots level involvement, actually get involved with practically helping the people in need, then that does start to change how you think and feel.
Thank you.
I think what Steph was saying is if our church leaders felt the pain, then they would be motivated to speak out. And I think the only thing I was going to say on that is the Methodist Church is got this project now around what it means to be a justice-focused church. If you wanted to say that as your response, or one of your responses, where's the leadership, or a challenge to the leadership, that would, from my perspective, would be a very powerful message. The church has to model what we believe in and live and act as if this mattered and if this is part of the gospel. And I think that's a challenge the church has still got to come to terms with. And absolutely, I'd love to see church leaders speaking about this because it matters to their friends and neighbours.
Just to say, the joint public issues team, of which the Methodist Church is a big part, did a lot of work a couple of years ago on the lies and myths that are told about people in poverty, and they did something similar, I think, to the Commission. And the main thing that came out of that report was nothing about us without us, so please don't speak for people in poverty, don't put words into their mouths. And I think that was the Methodist Church showing some leadership. I know there's more we can do, but there are some things in place, I want to say.
Thank you. I think we'll draw the session to a close now because we are trying to keep reasonably to time. There will be teas and coffees afterwards, so the conversation will be able to continue, and I'm sure Niall and Steph will be around to chat if you'd like. I want to say a little bit of a word in defence of our church leadership, in that they have been responsible for setting up this talking with, not the Walking with Micah project. It's a national initiative that's coming from our church leadership. It's a 2-year consultation to ask people in the churches what they feel is important about justice issues. I think it probably needs to go back to the stewards team to work out how to take it further forwards, but the church are actively asking for our feedback on how we think the church should respond to issues like this. So when the time comes, I hope the stewards team will invite responses, but when the time comes, if there are things that we've heard said here or from the floor that we want to throw back at our leadership, there is a process that's specifically designed to capture that information. So please look out for those opportunities when they arise over the next few months, I hope. I'd like to finish off with just a blessing that's taken from the Church Action on Poverty's Sunday prayer. I'm not quite sure whether this is something that rolls forward across the years or was specific to last year, but we'll say this together. I'll read the lines in the light print. Holy Trinity, you give dignity to all. Remind us that we are all treasured by you. Loving God, you lift up the lowly, those whose value is not seen. Jesus Christ, you bring good news to the poor. Holy Spirit, you free the captives, you challenge and inspire us. Amen. Two things. I just want to say a very real thank you to Niall and Steph for coming along and being with us. I think we'd like to show our appreciation. And the final thing is that there are some costs involved in running this series. If anybody would like to make a donation, we've got a GoFundMe page that will cover the costs of we've had. I should say that we are, in terms of trying to support some of the charities that have come to speak to us, we've been negotiating with the stewards that look after the communion collection. And we hope that over the coming year, some of our communion collections are going to go to these charities. So there will be some support for the charities and organisations from the church. So a little bit of money to cover our costs. We'll get even more money, we hope, through to the charities in the longer term. So thanks very much for everybody for coming along, and we'll break now for some tea and coffee.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to Richard for putting together what has been a really enjoyable series of Lent lectures. We've had some excellent speakers, and in particular tonight, brilliant speakers. It's been really enjoyable, and we've had some really good insights into issues that are really relevant in 2022, relevant to practicing Christians in 2022. So I want to say thank you to Richard for doing that, and a small token of our appreciation, please, if you just accept them. Thank you. And I can't finish without thanking the guy who pulled it all together here and online. Thank you very much, Ian.